They closed the feed at 03:47 hours, and for a moment nobody in the room said anything at all. Colton Ashworth's people had been watching the water for 6 hours through a satellite link, routed twice through Reykjavik, and once through a shell company in Halifax that existed only on paper. The feed showed gray ocean under a gray sky, and somewhere in that gray a scattering of debris that used to be a boat. A woman had gone into the Labrador Current at position 41 nautical miles off the Grand Banks, and the water there in early spring runs somewhere between 1 and 3 degrees Celsius, cold enough that a human body loses functional strength in its hands within minutes and loses consciousness on the outside estimate within 2 hours. "She's not coming back up," said the man monitoring the feed, a contractor named Priest who had never once in 11 years of this work seen a body resurface once it had gone under in water that cold. He said it the way a person recites something they have seen, proven true 100 times before. Physics doesn't negotiate. The sea keeps what it takes. Ashworth, watching from his office in a glass tower 40 floors above a city that did not know his name, allowed himself something close to a smile. He poured 2 fingers of something amber into a glass and did not offer one to anyone else in the room, because the room did not deserve to celebrate with him. This was his relief, earned across 11 months of trying to locate a woman who had, by every rational measure, made herself impossible to find. "Close it," he said. "Let the water finish what we started." They closed the feed. They believed in that room with the particular confidence of men who have never personally been wrong about anything that mattered, that the matter of Nora Kessler was concluded. They were not stupid men. They were simply working from an equation that did not include the one variable that had kept Nora Kessler alive through 11 months of being hunted and would keep her alive through the next 71 hours. She had never, in her entire life, done what the equation predicted. The Labrador Sea does not forgive, and that is not sentiment. That is thermodynamics. A body in water at 2 degrees Celsius loses heat roughly 25 times faster than the same body in air of the same temperature, because water conducts heat away from the skin with a speed and an indifference that air simply cannot match. Search and rescue technicians in the Royal Canadian Air Force are trained on the numbers the way pilots are trained on stall speed, because the numbers are the difference between a rescue and a recovery. 30 minutes of useful strength in the limbs. 60 to 90 minutes before the muscles begin shutting down in a cascading, irreversible sequence starting at the fingers and moving inward toward the core. 2 hours, in nearly all documented cases, marks the outer edge of survivability without flotation and thermal protection. There is no case in the training manuals for 71 hours, which is precisely why Captain Beckett Hale's hand went still on the cyclic the instant his flight engineer's voice came through the intercom with a tone Hale had heard exactly twice before in 14 years of search and rescue work, both times right before something changed the rest of his life. "Skipper," a pause that lasted perhaps 2 seconds and felt considerably longer. "You need to look at this." Hale brought the cormorant down through 600 feet of cloud that had been sitting low and mean over the Grand Banks since before dawn, and what he saw first was the wreckage, a section of hull, maybe 4 meters of it, riding low and canted in the swell. One more piece of the debris field that search crews had been combing for 2 days, and finding nothing in but cold water and the slow accumulation of disappointment. Then he saw her. She was lashed to the wreckage by a length of nylon cord, wound so many times around her forearm that Master Corporal Desmond Okafor, the SAR technician who went into the water for her, would later say it looked less like a person had tied the knot and more like a person's body had simply frozen into the shape of not letting go. Her other arm was locked across her chest, and in that arm, held against her body with a grip that had not loosened even in hypothermic unconsciousness, was a rifle, not slung, not stowed, held the way a person holds the one thing in the world they have decided is more important than their own survival. "Bring us down," Hale said. His voice came out quieter than he meant it to. Quiet in the specific way a person's voice goes quiet when the brain is buying itself time before it has to process something it does not yet believe. "Skipper, the water temp reading says, I know what it says. Bring us down." Okafor went into the water in a dry suit rated for conditions that would kill an unprotected person in minutes. And even through the neoprene and the training and 14 years of pulling people out of the North Atlantic, he felt something close to fear when he got close enough to see her face. Her lips had gone the color of the sky. Her skin had a waxy stillness to it that Okafor associated, professionally and privately, with people who did not need a helicopter anymore. He put 2 fingers to her throat, expecting nothing. He found a pulse, faint, arrhythmic, roughly 40 beats a minute where a resting heart should sit near 70, but present. A pulse is not survival. A pulse in a body that cold is simply the last stubborn refusal of an organ to stop. Getting the rifle away from her took longer than getting her out of the water. Her fingers later assessed by the flight surgeon as having been in a state of near-total neuromuscular shutdown for at minimum 18 hours would not release the weapon. Okafor did not force it. Something about the way she held it, deliberate, protected, positioned across her body like a person shielding an infant, told him this was not confusion. This was the last coherent decision a dying brain had made before it stopped making decisions. And some part of Okafor, without being able to articulate why, that decided that decision deserved to be respected until someone with more information than a rescue technician could tell him otherwise. They brought her up together, woman and rifle, inseparable, into a helicopter whose crew had trained for exactly this scenario and had never once believed they would actually encounter it. CFS Blackthorn sat inland from Gander, a Canadian Forces station with a role quiet enough that most of the country had never heard its name, and a medical wing equipped, deliberately, for situations that required both competent trauma care and an absence of paperwork. Nora Kessler was carried into that wing at 0619 hours with a core body temperature of 26 degrees Celsius, 4 degrees below the threshold at which most physicians consider a patient clinically viable, and a survival window that the attending flight surgeon described, off the record, as something I'm going to be arguing about with people smarter than me for the rest of my career. She woke up on the second day. She did not wake up disoriented. She did not wake up asking where she was, or how long she had been unconscious, or any of the questions the medical staff had prepared themselves to answer gently. She woke up, opened her eyes, found the rifle exactly where she had made someone put it, leaning against the wall within arm's reach of the bed, because Hale had made that call himself, over the objection of 2 separate officers who thought it was an unnecessary risk to leave an unidentified woman armed in a secure medical facility. And the first thing she said, in a voice scraped thin by 71 hours of salt water and cold, was, "Who has the scope?" Not a question about her injuries. Not a question about rescue. A question about a component of a rifle, delivered with the flat, immediate priority of someone whose mind had organized its entire waking sequence around a single piece of information before it had gotten to anything else, including her own name. Hale was in the room. He had made a habit, over the previous day and a half, of being in the room more than his rank strictly required, partly out of the professional instinct that told him this situation had layers nobody had briefed him on yet, and partly because he had pulled her out of the water himself, and there is a specific, unshakable responsibility that forms between a rescuer and the person they refuse to leave behind. "Nobody has the scope," Hale said. "It's on the rifle. The rifle hasn't left this room." Something in her shoulders released, fractionally, the way a structure settles once a load has been confirmed still standing. "Good," she said. "Keep it that way." Her name, according to the identification recovered from a waterproof pouch sewn into the lining of her survival suit, was Nora Kessler. The identification was Warrant Officer Priya Anand, determined within 4 hours of running it through 3 separate databases, almost entirely fabricated. Well, fabricated, professionally fabricated, fabricated by someone who understood exactly which gaps in a record system a false identity needed to fill and which ones it could safely leave alone. But underneath the false name, cross-referenced through a facial recognition pass that took Anand most of a night to authorize through channels she was not entirely sure she was allowed to use, was a woman who did not officially exist anywhere. No birth record, no school record past the age of 19, no employment history, a person who had been constructed at some point to leave no trail. and constructed well enough that whoever had built that absence had done it deliberately, professionally, and a long time ago. She's a ghost, Anand told Hale in the corridor outside Kessler's room, keeping her voice down out of a habit that had nothing to do with regulations and everything to do with the particular quiet that had settled over the wing since Kessler had been brought in. Not off the books ghost, built ghost. Somebody spent real money making sure this woman was never on paper. Which somebody? That, Anand said, is the part I can't find. And I don't love not being able to find things. Hale went back into the room. Kessler was sitting up now, the rifle across her lap, her eyes tracking him the way a person tracks something they haven't yet decided whether to trust. "You're going to want to know things," she said before he'd asked anything. "I'm going to tell you some of them. Not because I owe you an explanation. Because you pulled me out of water that should have killed me 19 times over, and that buys you more honesty than I usually give anyone. I'll take it. There's a laptop in my gear. Encrypted. 3 layers. The 3rd layer I haven't opened myself in over a year because opening it starts something I can't stop once it's started. I need your technical officer to verify the first 2 layers are intact and untouched. If they are, we talk. If they're not, I need you to get me off this base in under an hour because it means the people looking for me already know where I am." Hale studied her for a long moment. He had commanded search and rescue crews for 14 years, had pulled people from sinking trawlers and stranded climbers, and had downed civilian aircraft off the Burin Peninsula that still occasionally showed up in his dreams, and in all of it he had never once had a survivor open a conversation with operational security instructions. "Who's looking for you?" he asked. Kessler looked at the rifle in her lap, and something crossed her face that Hale would later describe to Anand as the particular stillness of someone doing arithmetic they already know the answer to and dread confirming out loud. "People who are very good at making things disappear," she said, "and who are about to find out I didn't." The laptop went to Anand, who spent 4 hours confirming the outer layers of the encryption were untouched, and 1 more hour trying, unsuccessfully, not to look impressed by the sophistication of it. When she reported back, Kessler exhaled for what appeared to be the first time in several minutes, and began, in a voice stripped of all inflection, to tell Hale a story she had apparently never told anyone the whole way through. She had been 19, she said, and living in a foster placement in Thunder Bay that had run out of patience with her the way every placement before it had, when a man who called himself Vaughn found her at a shooting range where she worked weekends setting pins and cleaning brass, and where the range owner had noticed, with some bewilderment, that this particular teenager could put 5 rounds through a target at 300 meters, using nothing but a borrowed rifle and mental math that should have required a ballistics computer. Vaughn did not offer her a job. He offered her something more dangerous, because it was true. A place where the thing she was strange and gifted at would finally matter to someone, where the years of being unwanted and unremarkable would be converted deliberately and completely into being necessary. "He told me there were people the law couldn't touch," Kessler said. "Traffickers, financiers, men who moved money for organizations that got children killed and never once saw the inside of a courtroom because they were smarter than the system built to catch them. He told me I could reach the ones nothing else could reach. And he was 17 years older than me, and he'd found me on a Tuesday when nobody else in my life had bothered to find me on any day at all, and I believed him completely." She had been operational within 2 years. The targets, for the first 3.5 years, checked out. She made certain of that herself, cross-referencing every mission package against open-source reporting with the same obsessive precision she applied to wind calls and barometric drift, because some part of her had always understood that belief without verification was how people like her got used. Then came the file on a woman named Marguerite Auclair. The package identified Auclair as a financial intermediary moving proceeds for a resource extraction consortium with ties to organized crime. Photographs of her at meetings with known figures, financial records suggesting laundering through shell accounts in 3 provinces. Kessler ran her standard verification. For the first time in 3.5 years, the verification did not confirm the file. It contradicted it, methodically and completely. Eau Claire was, in fact, an indigenous land rights advocate who had spent 4 years building a paper trail documenting illegal mining operations on unceded territory in northern Quebec. A paper trail that named, among its financial beneficiaries, several individuals whose other, better hidden business happened to be moving weapons and money for the exact kind of trafficking network. Kessler had spent 3.5 years believing she was fighting. "They didn't send me after a criminal," Kessler said. "They sent me after the one person who'd found them." She had not completed that assignment. That refusal, the first and only mission she had ever declined, had started a chain of events that ended 11 months later with her being run off a coastal road outside a fishing village on the Burin Peninsula, her vehicle forced into open water, and a recovery team standing offshore watching the wreckage settle with the calm satisfaction of men who had at last tidied up a loose end. She had not died. She had, in fact, spent those 11 months doing something considerably more dangerous than dying. She had been quietly assembling, mission by mission, contact by contact, financial thread by financial thread, a complete architecture of the organization that had built her, a structure Vaughn had once, cryptically, referred to as the Concordat, a name that meant nothing to anyone outside it and everything to the small number of people it had ruined. 2 years before her death was staged, Vaughn had come to her one final time. He had given her a drive, 3 encrypted partitions, he told her, containing everything he had gathered across 2 decades inside an organization he had helped build and had spent the second half of his career trying to quietly dismantle from within. The first partition was operational history. The second was financial architecture. The third, he told her, was something she was not to open until the Concordat's existing structure had already been broken, because the names inside it were protected, he said, by the same mechanisms that protected everyone else, and releasing them prematurely would simply hand the organization time to bury what mattered most. "Do you know where he is?" Hale asked. "Vaughn, no," Kessler said. "I think he's the kind of person who survives specifically because he understands, better than almost anyone alive, the cost of being found. I think he's still out there watching. I think when he decides it's time, it will matter more than almost anything I've done." A pause, brief and unreadable. "I hope he's still out there." Hale absorbed this in silence for a moment, the way a person absorbs information that reorganizes everything they thought they understood about the last 48 hours. "How did they know she was in the water for 71 hours? He asked, eventually, not of Kessler, but of himself, thinking ahead to the report he would eventually have to write, the report that would need to explain, in language his superiors would accept, how a survival window this impossible had been measured with any confidence at all. The answer, when Anand supplied it later, was almost mundane. Kessler's tactical watch, waterproof to 200 meters and running on a battery designed to outlast its wearer, had kept a continuous, uninterrupted timestamp from the moment of the crash to the moment Okafor pulled her from the wreckage. 71 hours, 4 minutes. Physics doesn't care whether anyone believes the number. The instrument simply recorded it. "For the record," Kessler said quietly, and there was something almost apologetic in it. "Whatever number the watch shows you, it's real." The interior threat arrived at 0113 hours the following night, and it arrived with a patience that told Hale immediately this was not an improvised response. This was a plan someone had built weeks earlier and simply been waiting to execute. Anand caught it first, the way she caught most things. A maintenance requisition for the base's secondary wing that did not match any scheduled work order. Filed by a technician whose credentials, when she pulled them, had been issued 11 days earlier for a position that did not appear on the base's actual personnel roster. She brought it to Hale at 2340 hours with the particular flatness of someone who has just confirmed something she badly did not want to be true. "Someone's inside the wire," she said, "and they didn't get in tonight. They've been building access for over a week." Kessler, when told, did not react with surprise. She reacted with the calm, immediate calculation of someone recalculating a firing solution after the wind has shifted. "Undertow," she said. "What?" "The Concordat's retrieval unit. I've only ever seen the designator in intercepted communications. Undertow. They don't do arrests. Their mandate is confirmation and recovery. Confirm the target is dead, recover whatever the target was carrying, remove anyone who's seen either. They operate in cells of 4. There's always an internal contact who does reconnaissance ahead of the operation. She looked at Hale directly. Someone on this base has been mapping your team's positions and confirming my location for over a week. They already know roughly where I am and roughly how many of you there are. You have less time than you think. Then we move you, Hale said, already turning to the door. There's a storage annex on the northeast corner of this wing, external access on 2 sides only, not on the base's current facilities map because it predates the current wing and was never properly decommissioned. It's not perfect. It's better than a room with 1 door and a hallway full of people who might not be who they say they are. They moved at 0126. Sergeant Lucas Fenimore secured the corridor. Corporal Ottilie Marsh and Corporal Theo Lachance took the annex's 2 external approaches, weapons drawn, breath visible in air that had turned sharp and cold the way it does on the rock in the small hours regardless of season. Okafor, who had no operational reason to be there and every personal one, stationed himself at the annex door because he had pulled this woman out of the ocean with his own hands and had decided, somewhere in the intervening 2 days, without quite articulating it to himself, that he was not prepared to lose her to whatever this was. The internal contact revealed themselves at 0159 and revealed themselves badly. A technician named Sorel, who had passed 2 separate identity checks over the preceding week and who moved, when the moment came, with the wrong kind of urgency, heading not toward the emergency assembly point. The rest of the base's night staff were converging on, but toward the communications room, attempting, Anand would later confirm from the logs, to access the base's primary uplink and transmit a location ping to an external relay. Fenimore reached him before the transmission completed. The 3 exterior operators moved with considerably more professionalism and considerably less success. One was intercepted near the perimeter fence by Marsh, who had spent 6 years with a reconnaissance unit before transferring to base security and whose hand-to-hand training had never, until that night, been tested against someone trying to kill her for real. The engagement lasted 11 seconds and ended with the operator restrained and Marsh's shoulder dislocated, an injury she would not fully register until the adrenaline receded almost an hour later. The second, positioned near the base's secondary communications array, was intercepted by Lachance mid-attempt at a backup transmission and subdued without discharge of a weapon, a fact Lachance would mention later with the specific pride of a man who preferred his outcomes bloodless when the option existed. The third simply walked away. Kessler, watching from the annex through a gap in the doorframe, recognized the pattern immediately. A woman from the base's administrative staff, moving toward the secondary exit at an unhurried, deliberate pace, the pace of someone who has assessed a failing operation and made a professional decision to preserve herself rather than complete it. Hale, radio in hand, made the call to let her go. "She'll carry the message back," he said to Fenimore's raised eyebrow. "I need the Concordat to understand something, that the transmission was made, that there's nothing left here worth sending anyone else for." The 4th operator, the external overwatch position, the one that had likely been tracking approach routes and exfiltration options from somewhere beyond the perimeter, was gone before anyone reached the tree line. Kessler, when Hale reported it, was unsurprised. "Under Tau protocol," she said, "the external position withdraws automatically the moment the interior fails. No coordination required. It's built to fail cleanly. That's what makes them effective. They don't panic when something goes wrong, because something going wrong was always accounted for." By 0417, the secondary wing had gone in the particular, ringing way a space goes quiet after violence has passed through it and left. Hale walked back to the annex. The door was open. Anand was inside with her laptop, wearing the expression of someone who has read the same line 4 times, because some part of her brain is refusing to accept it means what it says. Marsh leaned against the wall, favoring one shoulder. Okafor stood in the doorway. Kessler stood exactly where she had been standing when the operation began, the rifle in her hands, watching the corridor. "It's done," Hale said. "The base is secure." "It's not done," Kessler said. "It's started." The third partition opened at 0503 on Kessler's authorization in a room that had gone very quiet around a laptop screen. Anand's fingers moved across the keys with the deliberate care of someone diffusing something rather than reading it, and for nearly a full minute after the files decrypted, nobody spoke. Vaughn had not exaggerated. The third partition did not simply confirm what the first two had already suggested about the Concordat's financial architecture, it named names. Board members of legitimate companies who sat simultaneously on shell entities that laundered proceeds from trafficking operations across 4 provinces and 2 coastlines. A senior figure in a federal procurement office whose signature appeared repeatedly on contracts that routed government funds toward companies controlled at several removes by Colton Ashworth. A pattern of resource development consultations on unceded territory that mapped with uncomfortable precision onto exactly the kind of operation Marguerite Auclair had died trying to expose. "This isn't a criminal organization," Anand said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else in the room. "This is half a supply chain with a legitimate face." "That's what the third partition was always going to be," Kessler said. Vaughn didn't collect proof of a conspiracy. He collected proof of an economy. That's why he told me not to open it until the existing structure was already compromised. The moment this goes out, it doesn't just expose people. It breaks something a lot of other things are quietly built on top of. "Do we send it?" Hale asked. "Or do we wait for someone above my pay grade to tell me how?" Kessler looked at him for a long moment. Long enough that Hale understood she was making a calculation that had nothing to do with him personally and everything to do with 11 months of being hunted, 2 years of carrying a drive she had never wanted, and a decision she had apparently already made somewhere in the North Atlantic during those 71 hours when survival itself had seemed like a technicality. "Send it," she said. Every outlet Vaughn built into the release protocol all at once. No staged rollout. No waiting for verification from people who can be paid to slow verification down. The moment it's out everywhere, and there's nothing left worth sending anyone here for. The transmission completed at 0521, somewhere in a glass tower 40 floors above a city that had believed, for 2 days, that a particular problem had been solved by an ocean. Colton Ashworth's radio would eventually crackle with a report he had not been prepared to receive. From a woman walking calmly away from a base in Newfoundland with nothing to show for a mission that had, from the very beginning, been unwinnable. Not because Undertow had failed, but because the outcome it existed to prevent had already happened 3 years earlier in a 19-year-old's decision at a shooting range in Thunder Bay and had simply taken this long to finish arriving. Hale found her on the tarmac. 2 mornings later, watching a gray sky the same color as the ocean that had nearly kept her, the rifle finally, for the first time since he'd known her, not in her hands but slung properly across her back. "They'll come again," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Some of them," Kessler said. "The ones who still have somewhere left to run to. Most of what mattered went out with that transmission. What's left is cleanup, and cleanup isn't Undertow's job. That's for whatever's left of the legal system to figure out how to prosecute against a story this large." She glanced at him. "I don't know how much of it they'll actually get right. And Vaughn?" "I think he'll find his moment," she said. "I think when he does, it'll matter more than anything I sent out 2 days ago." A pause, the closest thing to warmth Hale had heard in her voice since the moment she'd woken up asking about a rifle scope instead of her own name. "I think you should hope you never have to find out what that looks like." She turned to go. Hale, watching her walk toward a transport that would take her somewhere he was not cleared to know, found himself thinking about 71 hours in water that killed most people in 2, about a woman who had organized her entire will to survive around the protection of a piece of evidence rather than the protection of herself, and about the particular uncomfortable truth search and rescue crews rarely got to sit with, that sometimes the thing worth pulling out of the ocean was never simply a person. Sometimes it was the one thing the ocean had been specifically instructed to make sure never came back up. She didn't look back before she reached the aircraft. She didn't need to. Some people, Hale was beginning to understand, only ever look forward, because looking back for them means counting everyone the water almost kept, and that is a number a person can only afford to calculate once.